Hi, I'm Tim Beiber with The Final Solution, and I'm here to do another lesson today about death metal scales. This was requested, and I have notes written down for some different scales, techniques, and how they apply to the genres. Before I start, I'm using my new 8-string guitar, and it's tuned like a 7-string with the extra high string, and it's tuned down a half step. So it's B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, all the way up to A flat. So, if you're just playing with the 6-string, ignore the top and ignore the bottom strings, and that's your 6-string guitar right here. So, we'll start with the scales. I would have to say Aeolian or natural minor would be the first scale we'll look at, because that's probably the most basic of the scales. It's used all the time, everywhere. If you play any instrument, you know the minor scale. So, we'll start with that one. And it's the 6th mode of the major scale. So if you play the major scale, that's all 8 notes, back to the octave, and you start on the 6th note of the major scale. And that 6th note is actually the 1st note of natural minor. So, that's scales everywhere. That's probably the most common. Second one, I would have to say this one is, it's really not used all that much. It's a Locrian scale, and it's the 7th mode of the major scale, and it has a diminished tonality instead of minor. So in Locrian, it's like Aeolian started on the 6th note of the major scale. Locrian starts on the 7th note. So there's Locrian. Again, it's not quite as common a scale as the rest of them, but it's used a lot more in the jazz or the metal scene. Since it has diminished tonality, we'll go to the diminished scale. Now the cool thing about diminished, and I'll get to whole tone in a minute, is that they're symmetrical scales. So once you learn the one pattern, you have it. And diminished, depending on what key you're in and how you want to do it, all you're doing is alternating whole steps, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, all the way through the octave. Now that means you can do it like this. Or that was the whole half, because they used a whole step first and then went to a half step. Or a half whole. That goes with the main interval with diminished and diminished bass scales is the minor third. Now that, like if you're playing pentatonic, that's minor third. But again, it depends on how you're using it. So there's the diminished scale. It's used quite a bit in the metal scene. It's one of the major ones. We'll go to whole tone now. Now that's the exact opposite. We'll go a little bit to chord theory. Everything's based off of the major scale and the major triads. So a diminished chord is actually, if you take the major interval, the diminished is smaller than what a major interval will be, like there's less half steps. A whole tone is actually bigger. It's augmented scale instead of diminished. So whole tone fits with the augmented chords. Whoops, that's not augmented. That was diminished first. It fits with the augmented chord. And this scale is all whole steps. So there's only 6 notes in the scale instead of 7. So what you're doing is playing 2 whole steps, move up a string, up a fret, and up a string, up a fret, and there's your octave. So there's actually less notes in the whole tone scale than the average scale. And there's one more note in diminished. There's actually 8 notes, 9 is the octave, in diminished. So it divides the intervals a little different. So now we'll take a step back to Aeolian, and I'll show you harmonic minor. Now, harmonic minor, the only difference is you take natural minor, and you raise the 6th note 1/2 step. The big popular player for harmonic minor is Yngwie Malmsteen. A lot of people use it, but if anybody, that's usually one of the first names that pops up when you think of that. Now we'll take the 5th mode of harmonic minor scale, which is Phrygian dominant. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now what you're doing is starting on a 5th note of harmonic minor. And Phrygian dominant is another one of the ones that's a big Malmsteen one. Now, for the most part, those scales can be used interchangeably. No, I don't mean that. I mean, if you're playing, like, just... something like that, where it's just the half steps. Harmonic minor and Phrygian dominant are good scales for that. If you're just going up a half step. Those are ones where harmonic minor and Phrygian dominant will go. And again, those scales go with diminished. Diminished, harmonic minor, and Phrygian dominant, they're like their own little family. You always see them in the same chord changes and like the same key. Now we'll go back another step to harmonic minor, and I'll show you Hungarian minor. Now, what you're doing is you're taking... First we took natural minor, and we raised the 6th note. Now what we're going to do is raise the 4th and the 6th note. So it's harmonic minor with a raised 4th. Now there's not... I mean, it's used, but it's again, it's another one that's not a super popular scale. The first song that comes to mind that uses Hungarian minor is There's No Business to Be Done on a Dead Planet by All Shall Perish. There's a good example of Hungarian minor. But again, it's not one of the more popular scales, but it's fun to mess with. It's almost like adding passing tones to harmonic minor. And I'll show you another cool thing with passing tones. They're used a lot, not quite as much in classical-based music, but jazz. And all it is really is it's adding notes that's not in the scale, and then adding them in to either build tension or maybe to help make an easier key change. And it depends on which intervals you decide to use. I'll use an example, Jeff Loomis solo, because it's pretty much a perfect example from River Dragon. It's come. So it's diminished. That's just a diminished scale, but then he adds the chromatic tones. So it adds a really interesting color to certain phrases. I mean, there's thousands of examples, but that's just one I could show you right now. So those are some of the main scales, metal scales. You can use any scale in it, but those are some of the first ones people think of. Now, a couple techniques. Again, I suggest you learn in as many scales and techniques as you can because it's universal. Just because Hungarian minor isn't very common and it's a darker sounding scale doesn't mean you can't use it in a fusion solo or anything. It's just not common. But if you know it, you can play around with it and come up with some phrases where you chop certain notes out of the scale and just use certain phrases, like you keep the key notes that make it that scale and just use them and make an arpeggio out of it or something like that. But the more you know, the more you can mess with. So I think it's really important. I don't think you should get caught up in, if it can either be technique or it can be feel. I don't believe that at all. I think you need both. Now I'll go to some techniques that are pretty common. And again, these techniques don't just show up in metal; they're everywhere. But just as an example, alternate picking, where you pick every note. Legato. Where you don't pick, it's more smooth. And then there's combinations of the two. It's called economy picking, where instead of picking each note, it's almost like adding sweep picking in, like you're trading strings like sweep picking, but certain notes are pulled off. Jeff Loomis is a big one. Michelangelo Badio is a big one. It can be tricky, but it also doesn't... Like, if you're not good at alternate picking, you can pick some notes and then let some notes just kind of fall off, like legato. And sometimes it makes things flow, or it adds some... just a little different color to the phrases. Then there's just down picking that helps the rhythm stay a little tighter. Again, it's not, that's a big thrash thing, is down picking. If you go to the big four, all the old thrash bands, Metallica, Testament, Megadeth, Slayer, Exodus, and all them, they're big down pickers. It does, because if you really listen close, when you pick down and when you pick up, it is a little different sound. So if you need a part that just sounds kind of sloppy, try down picking all of it, and it's because you're picking the notes all the same, so they're gonna all sound. It's gonna have the same attack. Sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it does. So play around with that. String skipping. That is a good way to use more fretboard or wider intervals. You don't always have to use it, but it's good to have. Then there's tapping. And then all the variations of all fingers and 2 or 3 fingers and everything. And then you can add like the tapping and the string skipping. For that, all you're doing really is you're playing one phrase and then you're taking it up an octave and playing it again, and you can copy up all the strings. That's another interesting way to make phrases. Sweep picking, all the different string variations. Found a dead spot there. Then pinch harmonics. That can be a way to accentuate certain parts or certain beats. You can land on a beat with a pinch harmonic, and it kind of makes everything jump. And then another part for rhythm playing especially is the rhythms you're actually using. Because that's a way you can play the same note. It's almost like you can almost cheat. But it's pretty interesting. You can play the same note, or the same 2 or 3 notes in a rhythm, but if you change the actual note pattern, it can make it really exciting. Like if you're just doing all down picking, you can almost take the same pattern and switch the riff, or switch the same riff and switch the rhythm around, and almost take it, make that a separate part of the song. Now, this is more of the philosophy section of it. I know there's going to be arguments and fights about this, but this is my thoughts. The whole purpose of having genres is to classify music. I don't think it needs to be this whole argument thing, oh, death metal's crap, or, jazz is crap, or anything like that. It's literally just a way to describe it. If I tell you Hatebreed is a hardcore band, you should know, hardcore is usually, it's basically like punk with metal influence. So if you know that, you can get a rough idea of how they are. And if you know already that you don't really like punk, then maybe hardcore isn't your thing. It doesn't mean it's bad. It just means, once I tell you that, you should be able to kind of get a rough idea of what it's supposed to sound like. If I tell you it's going to be black metal, you have a rough idea that it's going to be a lot of tremolo picking, some diminished. It might have some folk elements in it. It could be slow. It's not really, But if you know all those different versions of it, and the more classified you go, the better you can talk to someone else about it. Because then you go into it, you say, okay, it's death metal. Well, then there's like standard death metal like Death. There's brutal death metal like Cannibal Corpse. There's grindcore. There's technical death metal. There's, but each of them have specific elements that change, and some of them stay the same. So if I tell you it's, a deathcore song, you can say, is it more like All Shall Perish, or is it more like Whitechapel? Where Whitechapel is more the death metal, then All Shall Perish is more the metalcore. It's more melodic versus the other, but it's still part of the same genre. I'm not trying to preach bands or anything, but I'm just saying it's, I don't think it should be this big argument. I just think it is kind of important to know what you're talking about a little bit. So if someone asks you, oh, hey, I heard you listen to that band, what do they sound like? Well, they're a progressive band. Okay, well, you have a rough idea what elements are in that. So there's a little bit about the scales, techniques, the genres, and with that, I think I'm done. So thanks for watching, and if you have any other requests for lessons, Send a message. Let me know what you want to hear, and I'll do what I can with you. Thanks.